Well, we're going to read Revelation 18, the whole chapter, Revelation 18. You hear me, Mr. Billy?
I think that's a no.
I'm on.
18, Revelation.
Yeah.
He's talking to
You hear me?
you. He's talking to you.
You hear me okay? Hear me?
Not about fixing to.
Okay. Okay, we'll read the 18th chapter, Revelation, and you can see that the heading is the fall of Babylon. We've seen the destruction of Babylon, which is not the literal Babylon, but a type, a kind of worldliness, a church that is anti-church. We've seen the destruction of Babylon foretold 3 times, Revelation 14, 16, and 17. But now we have an entire chapter on the destruction of Babylon. I'll read the whole chapter. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her. And the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. And then I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven. And God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed." We're in Revelation 18, guys, and I'm just reading verse 7. "As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. For mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand afar off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots and slaves, that is, human souls. The fruit from which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand afar off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold, with jewels and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. And all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors and all whose trade is on the sea, stood afar off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets. For God has given judgment for you against her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more, and the craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more, and the light of the lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. In her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints, and of all who've been slain on the earth. In the second half of Revelation, we've just seen a series of overlapping images that explain what is going on in the world, what was going on in the first century, what is going on in our day, and what will happen at the end of time. So recapping, we had this picture of a woman and a child and a dragon. The woman is the church, the child is Christ, the dragon is the devil who makes war against Christ and his church. And then connected to that imagery, we had two beasts. The first beast representative of perverted government, and the second beast a false prophet representative of a perverse religion. And then we had the picture of Babylon likened in the last week to a prostitute, because like a harlot dressed up and looking attractive on the outside, it's full of gross idolatry and abomination on the inside, but entices the world to come to her. That's the image. And we saw it chapter 16 and 17 and 18. Now then moving into the rejoicing in 19, this overlapping imagery of Babylon. It's thereabouts, and then there's a whole chapter devoted to it. So what is Babylon? Well, we know that it was an empire and a literal city. It was where God's people in the Old Testament were taken captive. So Babylon in the Old Testament is the place that took God's people captive. But in the New Testament and in Revelation, it stands for anti-church. In other words, the opposite of Christ's bride. And there's a reason in chapter 19, we'll have the marriage supper of the Lamb. There is two women. You can join yourself to one or the other. One is the harlot that is Babylon, and one is the bride that is the church. So Babylon is a picture and refers to in the New Testament to corrupt society and decadent civilization. And if you have a word for it, what Babylon represents is worldliness. It doesn't here refer to a literal historical kingdom, but Babylon is a composite picture of many kingdoms. When this was written, they would have thought of Rome, because it was the leading empire and it had 7 hills. Rome was set on 7 hills. And there's a number of images that you would think, aha, John's talking about Rome, and indeed he was. But you can't just leave it there. It wasn't just Rome, it was Tyre, it was Sodom, it was Nineveh, even at times Jerusalem. And Babylon is wherever there's corruption, idolatry, and immorality expressed. There are Babylons in America. There are Babylons in Asia, in Africa, in Europe. Wherever worldliness in a culture makes sin look attractive, and especially if they make it look pervasive, that is, there's no other option but to join in, that's Babylon. Babylon is the enticing option, the easy option, the way to get on, that if you do this, you'll be okay. You can get along, you can make a living, whatever. So Babylon is that picture of whatever is pervasive in order to get along. Whatever the world does to press on you, well, everyone lives this way, that's Babylon. So we are right to see the dangers that exist in the world around us, the many ways that a corrupt state or a corrupt religion can make war against the church. And we've seen those images throughout Revelation. We're in chapter 18, Angela. But don't miss the central word in the book, which is overcome. The danger in Revelation isn't that there would be those who would make war against the church. There's an even greater danger that Revelation reveals to us, that we might compromise with the enemy of the church. So it's a long chapter, I read a lot, but we can get at the chapter by zoning in on 3 verses. It's important to read it all, but we get the sense of the chapter from 3 verses. In the very beginning, in verses 2 and 3, we have a summary of Revelation 18 in verses 2 and 3. And in verse 4, we have the point of application. So there's 3 summary points from verses 2 and 3. 3 realities about Babylon. Number 1, Babylon was great. That doesn't mean it was good, but it was great. And that is her name. Verse 2, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's prosperous. Babylon's prosperous. In verse 16, you see, alas, alas for that great city. In verse 10, alas, alas, you great city. So she's great, she's powerful, she's mighty. And above all, the emphasis in Babylon is on her wealth and luxury. You see that every kind of cargo was bought and sold in Babylon. Commerce and industry flourish in Babylon. In verse 7, she glorified herself, lived in luxury, so she's supremely prosperous. The list in verses 12 and 13, gold, silver, jewels, precious stones, fine clothes, costly material, and then the spices, cinnamon, spice, I guess everything nice, and then actually things not so nice, and then animals. We wouldn't be over-interpreting that if we thought if something existed, it existed in Babylon. It's kind of like if you want to get anything at all, you could get it in Babylon. And it isn't that the possession of things, having luxury, makes you guilty of Babylon. Some people try and pin that on people who have things. But if you define luxury as having something that you don't need, if that's your definition of luxury, then we all live in luxury. We all do. And I would argue that in most places in the world today, definitely in America, definitely in Europe and the West, everyone lives in luxury because we all have something that we don't need. So it's not that you have items that are nice. The Bible talks about beauty. The Bible talks about blessing. But rather it's seen that we trust in that. We trust in that. And as we'll see in a moment, it's gaining those luxuries at the expense of someone else. Now, I am not an economist. I do like figures. I'm more interested in history. I'm a preacher. I'm not an economist. But for most of human history, if you work out, if some had more, they had more because some had less. For most of human history. And wealth was really a zero-sum game. Maybe you had a better harvest than someone else. But for most of human history, if someone got rich, they probably took it from someone else. Or they had the resources from another land. Or they had people that they were serfs. Then about 200 years ago, if you look at GDP across the history of the world, it suddenly goes up like a hockey stick. It suddenly zooms all the way up about 200 years ago. And it is no longer the case that if you have something, it's at the expense of someone else. But in Rome, if you had, it was on the back. It was because someone did not, or you did it on using someone else. At the end of this list, after the wheat and the cattle and the sheep, it says slaves, because that's how Rome existed. That's how Rome was powerful. The merchants and the kings, getting rich off Babylon, turned a blind eye to everything else because they got in on the riches of this great civilization called Rome. The Bible gives moments of feasting in our lives. And feasting is great, but we need to fast as well. It's feasting and fasting. Babylon is found all over the place. You can find it in New York. You can find it in London, Paris, Tokyo, where there's great size, there's great wealth, there's great buildings, there's great influence, there's great history, there's great power. And you can tell what the people worship actually in any given place by their tallest buildings. It used to be the case that the tallest buildings used to be cathedrals or churches. These used to be the tallest building. Maybe it still is in some places, like if you go down to Fort Lauderdale, Coral Ridge, or there are churches that have big high steeples. And you could say, well, that's a monument to the glory of man. But it used to be that the highest point in the city was the steeple, because that's the most important thing going on in that town. The most important thing going on in that town was church. So the highest building was a church or a steeple. Well, what's the most important building in most towns? Commerce, probably, or sports stadiums, financial buildings. If you go to London, Canary Wharf, the city is littered with all the banking signs. JP Morgan, HSBC. You can just see them from miles away. Chase, you just see the buildings lit up. In other buildings, Vegas, for example, what are the highest, what are the most luxurious buildings? The casinos. So you get a sense for a place, and it isn't the case that the most impressive buildings in town anymore are churches. But what is it that they value, that they may be drawn to worship by seeing their tallest buildings? Where is their power? What do they celebrate? Well, Babylon celebrated greatness, but greatness in influence and in worldly power. So that's the first thing. Secondly, Babylon was the means by which many nations and many peoples of the earth have grown rich. And that's in verse 3. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth and the merchants of the earth. There's three groups mentioned in this chapter. Verse 9, the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep. So the first group, meaning the nations of the world, came in the first century to Rome, or to the spirit of Babylon, to get rich. The kings got rich off Babylon. And then in verse 15, the merchants of the wares who gained wealth from her, they stand afar off. And then verse 17 into 18, the shipmasters, the seafaring men, and the sailors, they cried as they saw the smoke. So you have three groups: the kings, the merchants, and the sailors. And one by one they come when they see the smoke arising from Babylon, and they weep, because they see their own riches going up in smoke. That's how they got rich. That's how they grew luxurious and opulent, each of them. So Babylon represents the international center of economic and cultural power, and all the peoples of the earth were willing to do whatever it took to share in the power that was flowing from Babylon. Henry IV inherited the French throne in 1589. At first he kept his faith, his Protestant faith, which was rare for a French king. But after 4 years of conflict, he converted to Catholicism, uttering those famous words, "Paris is well worth a mass." In other words, if I choose between changing my religion and getting Paris, I'll change my religion. It's worth me to become a Catholic if I get the city. And that same spirit we see is the spirit of Babylon. That temptation to compromise, that temptation to get on, that temptation to see, maybe the bells and whistles of maybe what we deem a successful church, maybe to capitulate in order that we may gain what Babylon has to offer. Now, Rome was a great civilization, and in many ways we stand in the shadow of Rome. We're influenced by Roman civilization, by cultural and intellectual artifacts. But Rome, even though there's so, like the way we do roads and everything, but the city of Rome was also Babylon, decadent, opulent, full of power and influence. And in verse 13, dependent upon a class of slaves. It was full of brothels that catered to the Roman men. The empire brutalized its enemies. John's point in Revelation is simply this: the kings, the merchants, the sailors looked the other way. But they committed sexual immorality because they went along with Babylon in order to get their own power. And I state again, it's not wrong to want things of beauty, but this is luxury at all costs. I'll ride over wherever, I'll ride over whomever to get. And it's interesting to think of what heroes we have, what heroes we follow. If all somebody's heroes are celebrities, or someone who's famous for their looks, or for their wealth, or for their fame, then we will be shaped by the people we worship. And then we'll think it's our right to have the wealth, the looks, the fame. So the kings, the merchants, and the sailors all did whatever they had to do so that they might get rich from Babylon. So we've seen that Babylon is great, not in a good way, but it is great. We've also seen that Babylon, there was these groups of people who got rich off Babylon. And thirdly, the third principle in verse 5, Babylon will fall, and when she falls, she'll fall hard. Her sins are heaped as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquity. In verse 8, we read the judgment will come from God. In verse 10, we see the judgment will be swift. In verse 10 and 17, her wealth will be removed, and there's retribution double for her sins. She'll go from a luxurious metropolis to a barren wasteland in an instant. And that's why these three groups who were getting rich off Babylon, the kings, the merchants, and the sailors, stand afar off, because all their hope had been in Babylon. All their hope had been in Babylon. Their hopes for their future, their hopes for prosperity for them and their families, their hopes were all tied up in Babylon. And when Babylon went up in smoke, so did their dreams, and they stand afar off and weep. So we see from this chapter that Babylon's glorious and decadent culture will unravel. If you look at what happens at verse 22, first of all, it's the beauty of the arts. And it's really sad, actually. There's a lot about here. The sound of harpists, of musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. It's actually very bleak, very sad. The arts, the music unravels. And the promise and the blessing of industry is nixed. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. The sound of the middle will be found in you no more. So after the arts, after industry, then human relationship, verse 23. The light of the lamp will shine in you no more. The voice of the bride and bridegroom will be heard no more. The merchants and the great ones were deceived. It's not wrong to live in comfort. But what is wrong is to think that that's your best life. It's wrong to think that you can achieve your best life now. It's not wrong to want this joy of music, and we all love good music. And it's not wrong to want to have a wonderful wedding. That's part of giving the life that God has given us. But the folly of human civilization is that lasting joy can be found in Babylon. That lasting joy can be found in Babylon. So verses 22 and 23 says that if we're into music, if we're into arts, don't put your hopes in Babylon. If work and industry is your thing, that's good, but don't put your hopes in Babylon. In verse 2, she's a dwelling place for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for the unclean and detestable beast. The Old Testament would use animal languages, a haunt of jackals. All that will be left in her. Have you ever driven through a ghost town? I actually quite like driving through, and if you took a picture in black and white, it could be from whatever century it was. You see a rusting old wheel or a rusting old petrol pump, and maybe it was a boom town that flourished for a couple of decades. Maybe Olympic venues. I remember London after 2012, after the Olympics came and went, the Olympic Village became a ghost village where people lived. It's like a deserted movie scene. All the places that are shiny Olympic venues, there's no need for them. They make some use as a stadium, but then the weeds grow up and they poured into all this money for 2 weeks and the whole thing becomes desolate. We've been through parts of cities that have been burnt over. Or if you've watched The Lion King, as I used to have to do, Pride Rock after Scar took over, it was desolate. A literal haunt of jackals is what it became. No blessing, good for nothing. There's no colour, but it's just dark and creepy. Life is short. Babylon will not last. Babylon will fall and fall hard. And God isn't telling you something you do not need to hear. He's saying, don't live for this city that will not last, but live for the city that will remain. If you look at the refrain that recurs, for this reason her plagues will come in a single day. Verse 10, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour. And again in 17, a single hour, all this wealth will be laid waste. Then verse 19 even, again, alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, for a single hour laid waste. So just like that, it'll be gone. In one explosion of God's judgment, Babylon will be gone in a day. So what should we do? Well, verse 4 tells us, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. If you mix the biblical imagery with what we've been studying in our Lord's Day, we would say the plagues are coming, now's the time to leave Egypt. Or Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. Facing God's judgment, and the angels tell Lot, hurry, take your daughters and wife, and the city will be swept away. They say, flee, don't look back. Lot's wife looked back. She turned to a pillar of salt. The New Testament says, remember Lot's wife. Well, that seems harsh. But let us not go easy on Lot's wife. God warned her, but she looked back. Because she believed that God was calling her out of blessing into cursing. But God calls us out of cursing into blessing. Babylon is not the life of blessing. So when God says, get out of there, Lot's wife looked back because she said, that's where I belong. It didn't matter if she left the oven on. It doesn't matter at all, because that was the old life. But if that's where her heart was, then God treated her the same as he did those in Sodom and Gomorrah. And in Luke 17, verse 28, likewise as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven, destroyed them all. So will it be on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, let the one who's on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down and take them away, but likewise let the one who's in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Because ultimately she loved Sodom more than she loved the word of the Lord. 2 Corinthians 6 talks about not being unequally yoked with unbelievers, quoting Isaiah 52, go out from their midst and be separate from them. So what does that mean? What does that even mean? Where are we supposed to leave? Are we supposed to go and live off the grid? Well, you can still have Babylon in your heart if you live off the grid. It's not a message saying we must physically leave the city, but because there's as much Babylon in an underground bunker than there is in the cities. Well, how do we leave Babylon then? What does it mean? Well, the answer is in verse 4, lest you take part in her sins. We leave Babylon by leaving the sins of Babylon behind. We don't physically, just pack a U-Haul and go. No, we leave the spirit of Babylon behind. And what is the spirit of Babylon? It is, I must do whatever it takes to get on in Babylon. I don't want anyone in Babylon to be ashamed of me. Without thinking, I don't want the Lord to be ashamed of me. Or I must do whatever it takes to get rich in Babylon. And that's why it's called adultery, spiritual adultery, really. Because everyone was doing it. The kings were at it, the merchants were at it, the sailors were at it. The Christians were not. They wouldn't compromise their loyalty to Christ, like the church married to Christ, their fidelity to the truth, to make their way in Babylon like everyone else. What would spiritual adultery with that Babylon look like for us today? This could become legalistic or convicting, but what might it look like? Well, what might it? Well, it's treating employees fairly. Profit's not wrong, but you must put profit after principles. And I would say probably this isn't a danger for our church, but I would say it's a danger for society at large, that people put having children so far down their priority list because they can't lose that standard of wealth. I've come across people who would say that to me. I saw a tweet that said in 1993, or an X, whatever it's called, 60% of Americans in their early 30s had one child, and now that number has gone from 60% to 27%. So 1993 to 2026, people in their 30s had at least one child, now that number's 27. It's not a problem, I'm not saying it for this church, but I think it's good to see the problem, how it affects society as a whole. Because Babylon doesn't work if you've got the inconvenience of kids. Or maybe there's some who are tempted to make ethical compromises as a doctor or a lawyer or a realtor in case you might lose your business or lose your job. Maybe you've given yourself to make decisions about the future based on what income you can make, and that's the only criteria, without thinking, am I close to a good church? Tragically, I've seen that all too often, that people leave, they're part of a church, they leave for economic reasons only, and then they don't find a good church and they stop going to church. And, if I'm going to, how do I educate my kids? Do we sacrifice our own time for spiritual disciplines? Maybe some overlook just because, and I don't know these things, but I mean, be aware of them, that the online influencer, a social media influencer, looks a certain way, or the average Mississippian lives a certain way, then we have to look and live like that. So the temptation is to do whatever it takes to get on. It's kind of a magic spell. People are sucked in by that sorcery. We don't think clearly. Babylon gets into our systems. We have to dress a certain way because everyone dresses this way. Or I have to watch these things because after all, everyone else watches these things. I have to give my life completely over to my kids' sports because everyone else does. I'm going to be a soccer mum just because everyone else is. Or might be going to a lake or a beach, which I like very much, or going to kids' events around the region. And then suddenly you look at your church attendance and you've attended church 18 times out of 52. Because there were more important things than worshipping God. And one of those was following your kids around the country. So where is Babylon alive in our hearts? There's a sermon illustration, it's quite well known. It's called The Big Rocks in a Bucket. If you have a bucket and you have the little rocks in first, and you have to put the big rocks in, they will stick out and you won't be able to carry the big rocks in the basket. But if you put the big rocks in first, the little ones can fall around it. But you have to make sure the biggest rocks get in your basket first. And I would argue that the biggest rocks for us has to be Jesus, Bible, Christianity, church. But for all too many, they're the small rocks. And the big rocks are our kids' sports, and its creature comforts much, and they take priority over the worship of God. And Babylonian worldliness, they say, well, that's not Babylonian. Babylonian is the people who are out there committing sexual sin. But if there's anything that you put as more important than God, then you've been sucked into Babylon. The two sins are compromise and confidence. We compromise with Babylon, and then we put our confidence in Babylon. And we think that we're secure because Babylon is secure. A lot of people prior to 2008 thought that they were just fine because they trusted the banks. And I'm not saying you don't trust banks. I believe that we should live lives of peace and contentment. And I had a huge discussion with somebody in the church in Vienna at that time, who then took his money out of the bank and buried it in his back garden, and I told him that wasn't a great idea. But so the point being is, but Babylon doesn't provide security. Babylon does not give you security. There is only one secure place. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. In Luke 12:19, he said, I'll say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. That's the spirit of Babylon. Now, we know that there are proverbs about how to look to the ant, and he stores up. So retirement is good. So savings is good. Financial planning is good. But Babylon says, my confidence is in that. My confidence isn't in Jesus. My confidence is in my stocks and my shares. Look again at verse 7. She glorified herself, lived in luxury, and said, I sit as a queen, no mourning shall I see. It's possible for us to have that spirit. Individuals, families, nations, cities. Look at me, I've made it. But the scary thing is that it be gone in an hour. There's one group that rejoices when Babylon is overthrown. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles, God has given judgment for you against her. So Babylon will fall, and it will fall hard. Will we be like the kings, the merchants, and the sailors who are crying? Or will we be like heaven, the saints, and the apostles who are rejoicing? Revelation always pushes us to a choice. It pushes us to a choice. There's the two women. There's the whore of Babylon or the bride of Jesus Christ. There's two masters. There's a beast or a lamb. There's two cities. There's Babylon or New Jerusalem. And you can't have both. You can't have both. So you're either on the side of one of the women, the bride of Christ or the whore of Babylon. You either have a beast for your master or a lamb for your master. And you either dwell in Babylon or in New Jerusalem. You cannot be at home in both. These are good desires. God wants us to be in a place with singing. I'll be touching that again on Sunday. Christ welcomes you to his city, and he's gone to prepare a place for you in that mansion. He will take you by the hand and lead you there. Christ is calling, but we have to leave Babylon. We have to turn from Babylon, know his grace, know his rest, and as Pilgrim's Progress did, we journey to the celestial city. The prodigal son would have never have made it home until he came to his senses. And he realized that eating slop with pigs was not his real home. But we could put it this way from our study on Lord's Day mornings. We'll never make it to Canaan unless we leave Egypt. They wouldn't have made it to Canaan if they didn't leave Egypt. So come out of her, my people, says the Lord, lest you take part in her sin. So grab hold of the one who reaches down to grab hold of you, to give you the life that really is eternal, that really is secure, and really is lasting in the city where Christ will shine and God will be with him from the throne. There's no sun, there's no lamps, because Christ is all in all. Let me know.